Welcome to our first Leadership for the Liminal Space. I don't know what we're calling these, coffee break moment, something like that.
Something like
Um,
that. I don't know if we have a name yet, but
we don't yet.
that's
We'll
good.
come up with one. That'll be on our
Yeah.
to-do list. Um, Meanwhile, we'll live in the liminal, which is what we're talking about today.
Yeah.
Liminal spaces is the part of our first webinar coming up. And we thought what we'd do is talk a little bit about the necessity of liminality and do that by sharing some stories of how that liminality has shown up in our work as business partners and as at the Center for Holding Space. So Heather, I'm gonna toss the ball to you. Talk
Yeah.
to me a little bit about what it was like, because you were doing this work before we became the center. So what was sort of the progression and the liminality of sort of getting to the place where you realized that the work needed its own space and had to grow in a different container than you had currently been
Yeah.
holding it in?
Yeah. So as I was thinking about this, one of the things that really feels important to me is that liminality and creativity kind of go hand in hand. That creativity needs some measure of liminality, needs something to shift into a state of unknowing in order for something new to be born. And I think that's when we think about our story of emergence, the emergence of the center. It came out of this place of things had started to feel, because I had been building a fairly successful business, doing this myself, and you were alongside me and through much of it as my assistant, working to build it. But then it became more and more clear that one of the things that was needed was more solid foundation in terms of collaborative leadership, because I was feeling a little bit isolated in trying to lead and trying to make all the decisions, and was feeling, and gradually things were feeling more and more wobbly and more liminal. And I can't say the moment that that started, like, and I think that's the thing with liminal spaces is sometimes there's blurred boundaries. Like it's not like, I mean, sometimes you're thrust into a liminal space, but sometimes it's this sort of gradual awakening to the state of things as they are is not sufficient and something new needs to be born now. And I think that's what had gradually started to happen for me, is like there was a feeling of discontent in the way I was doing things. There was a feeling of this isn't enough. There was a feeling of, it was also, we were in our conversations talking about how we didn't want to build this as kind of guru-led body of work. We wanted it to be a collective body of work. Some of those ways, and we were, increasing discontent with the way that capitalism was encouraging us to build empires, kind of, and we are kind of anti-empire building. And so some discontent with the culture, with the way things, the expectation on me to show up in that certain way. And that's the kind of messy space out of which something new can be born. And that's why, as much as liminal space can be really uncomfortable, I also recognize when I find myself going into it, and we've been in that place again recently, to be honest, when I find myself going into it, into that sort of like bit of darkness, bit of uncertainty, I also have this little bit of hope that there's something new that's going to come out of this. Some shift is going to come that needs to happen right now. So it's almost, we've both birthed babies, so we know that process too, of this like gestation and birthing process, which is sometimes similar to a liminal space too, of waiting for something new to be born. And so that's how it was. And then sometimes, and comes out of Theory U. I remember when I was learning Theory U, they talk about sometimes it's almost like you go through this messy place, and then there's a moment where the new thing is just ready to be born. And sometimes it can happen fairly quickly, and all of a sudden you're on your way. And that moment for us happened in Arizona. We had decided to hire Pam Slim as our consultant to help us figure out what this was. We didn't know going into that meeting that the Center for Holding Space would be what would be born coming out of that day-long consultation with her. But it was like there was this moment, and then it was just so clear this is the thing that needs to be born. And I can still remember sitting in the airport with you, looking at each other. It's like, what just
What
happened?
just happened? I do too. I don't think I'll ever forget that feeling of like, oh man, like it felt like we had been given this new puppy or something, and it's like,
Yeah.
here, you're adopting this, and we were like, okay.
Are we up for this?
uh, can we handle this? Like, are we sure this is what we wanted? What is happening here?
Yeah.
But it did feel very right. I think you're right. It was, I had an inkling that something like that was coming, but when we finally started speaking those words out loud, it was like, oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah.
Yeah,
And that too, it launched us into it, that was just the beginning of another liminal space of trying to
exactly.
develop all of this
Yeah.
too, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, it's funny, we talk about the liminal space as, so I think sometimes people hope that it's this temporary thing, and sometimes it is, but it usually is a temporary liminality into the next liminality.
Exactly. It almost prepares you for the next one in some way.
Totally.
Yeah.
Well, but that's part of why I think we're trying to offer this course, is because we're learning that the leadership required in liminality, that kind of leadership can be developed and grow so that you can go from liminality to liminality without the kinds of disruption internally
Yeah.
that can implode things, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, even when I say that, I mean, I've come to some um peace with liminality in a sense. Like I've come to
Mm-hmm.
this, I have this capacity to be in relationship with the liminality. And I remember saying this years ago, and people would look at me with a bit of puzzlement. I would say, grief has been one of my lifelong relationships because I've kind of,
Yeah.
oh, it just keeps showing up as a teacher in my life. And
Yeah.
similarly with liminality, like it feels like, oh, here you are again. Like I see it show up. It's like, oh, old friend, you've come back to visit. And it's not always a welcome visit. It's like,
Huh?
I sometimes want to block the door and say, no, I don't want this anymore. I'm done. But it's like, oh, there's a little bit of familiarity. There's a little bit of I know that I can handle it, and we know we can handle it. And similarly, you and I have been through another version of liminality. Even in the birthing of this course, felt like another
Mm-hmm.
version of that, the leadership for liminal spaces, where like, something new has to be born now. Like there's something we're ready for, or we're not quite ready for, but it feels like it needs to come anyways.
Yeah.
And you kind of walk through it and you learn to walk through it. And I think that's exactly what we want to talk about in leadership for liminal spaces is how do we equip ourselves? How do we surround ourselves with the right people to do this? And that was
Mm-hmm.
part of it when the center was born. It's like, okay, we're not really meant to be in liminal spaces on our own, isolated. That's not the culture of like individualism does not fit with being grounded guides. And
No,
so we
not
need
at
to
all.
move into this. How do we do this as a collective? Move through these liminal spaces with as much groundedness and grace and compassion and tenderness as possible.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so we're hopeful that you will come learn with us, as we share some of what we've learned, and then also be in a co-learning space with you, because that's one of the things that we love at the center, is that we're not guru-fied.
Yeah.
we have some of we have some tools, we've got lots of learning, but we always invite collaborative learning at the end of the day, because we learn as much from our participants as we teach
Exactly.
most of the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah, always.
Always. And yeah, we're really excited about this feels, yeah, just thinking about the friction of liminality, and its necessity in creating something new. There's often a clarity that can come in that liminality, like we experienced with the center, and uh being in relationship with that liminality and expecting that there are going to be those moments of clarity where it's like, oh right, this is the next thing,
Yeah,
is
exactly.
so, it's encouraging, and we want to be able to encourage folks in that
Yeah.
as well,
Yeah.
that yeah, liminality does sort of go from one to the next, and also there are these wonderful moments of, oh right, and the
Yeah.
next right thing that you can find.
Yeah. Well, and I now that I live in the Pacific Northwest on Vancouver Island, I've become I've developed a relationship with fog the same
Love
way as
that.
liminality. And you and I talked about the fog, like you were talking about not that long ago how it just terrifies you to be in
Yeah,
fog. There's a scariness to it.
don't like it.
And I find with lim like fog is almost like being in liminal spaces. You drive
Mm,
along the highway and you just have this period where it's like I can't see 5 feet in front of my car. And then all of a sudden the fog breaks and there is nothing as glistening and beautiful as the sun right after a foggy patch. Like it's just the world opens up in this new way. And I think that's what we're talking about. It's like,
yeah.
yes, we're going to go through liminal spaces. And then all of a sudden there's this clarity. There's something that lands, something that needs to be born.
Mm,
And so that's what we want to invite you to be participating in with us, this exploration of what this means. And we're going to keep having these chats on YouTube once in a while that we'll share, and then but we'll go much deeper on the webinars and in the conversation circles or the study group that we have
mhm.
as part of this program.
Yeah. Registration's open. Leadership for Liminal Spaces. Check us out, centerforholdingspace.com. We'll see you there.